Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Today we will be discussing the strategic partnership between Russia and India in the light of the recently concluded summit meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Putin in the city of Sochi in Russia. Russia has been traditionally one of India's biggest strategic partners, time-tested strategic partner. Russia has stood by India in several international forums on a variety of issues, ranging from Kashmir to a seat on the UN Security Council, and on the question of the export control regimes, India's membership of the export control regimes like the MTCR, the energy, etc., etc. Russia also happens to be one of India's biggest arms suppliers, defense suppliers. In fact, 62% of India's defense supplies come from Russia at this point of time, and mind you, India is the biggest defense importer in the world today. The 62% is of course decreasing because of the supplies coming from the United States. And there have been, despite this robust, time-tested relationship between strategic partnership between Russia and India, there have been some tensions between the two sides due to external factors, of course. The Russians are concerned about India's increasing closeness to the United States and the increasing strategic partnership with the West in general. India is concerned about the partnership between Russia and China, Russia and Pakistan, and the sort of the rise of the troika in the Asian region among Russia, China, and Pakistan. And with the withdrawal of the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, things are probably going to change in the region even more. So how do we look at our strategic partnership with Russia in this context, and what implications does this have for India's national security? To discuss this and more, we have today with us Professor Anuradha Chenoy from the School of International Studies of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Chenoy teaches courses on Russia and Central Asia and has been a consultant for the United Nations. She was also the Dean of the School of International Studies. Professor Chenoy, welcome to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you, but I might just tell you that I've just retired, so I no longer, informal.
A professor never retires.
Yeah.
Professor Chenoy, it is usually said that India and Russia has a special partnership, special relationship. If I may ask you, if you could sort of tell our viewers, what is the background to this this special partnership, special relationship between Russia and India?
Well, look, the special partnership is very much part of a historical process, stretching now into almost 50 to 60 years. Right. At a time when, we don't have to go deeply into history, but broadly the parameters were such that there was a period in history in the 50s and 60s when India was very isolated from the West. Right. And they sought, as a post-colonial, newly independent country, they created a partnership with other developing countries. Right. And Russia was the only great power which was supportive of that. In fact, the US, Britain and others did not give India the kind of assistance they needed for developing their economic infrastructure or even the economic base, the impact of which you see today. The steel plants, the iron ore plants, many sectors of science and technology, the nuclear research. Right. So it was Russia which came in all this while. Now, of course, currently things have changed. We are in a totally new phase where India is also seeing itself as a major power.
Well, Professor Mitra, before you move on, I just want to ask you also about the political relationship that India and Russia has had in the past. It's not just about material benefits for India, because India got material benefits from the United States and European countries as well. But I think with the Soviet Union, would you say that there was also a certain political strategic relationship, as it were?
Absolutely, and there are major markers as well as there are processes in that. Right. The process fact is that the two countries don't have any conflict of interest against each other. That's correct. They have never had any problems about seeing third countries. They have a similar view. When even India had its worst periods, for example, the war against China, And though Soviet Union was aligned with China at that period and they called themselves brothers, Soviet Union still remained neutral in that war. And in fact, it was one of the breaking points of Soviet relations with China. And yes, and similarly, the wars with Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh, there was a great deal of assistance from the Soviet Union, and therefore that major Indo-Soviet strategic tie-up in 1971 onwards, it went to a very high level. And since then also, whether it's the issue of their vision on other countries, wars in West Asia, unilateral interventionism, regime change, on all these, Russia now and India find themselves on the same side internationally. And so there's a deep, therefore, political, strategic, and social and cultural relations. We mustn't forget also the soft power between them, the great interest in Indian cinema and Indian culture, the exchange of students, the huge number of Russian scientists who were here, the huge number of Indian doctors who've been trained there.
But all that is changing today, isn't it? The soft power issue especially.
It's changing, but I think in this particular informal summit, you can actually see again a realignment, and I think we can discuss that.
Right. I mean, that's my next question actually. What is your take on the Sochi summit? Was it the desire for a material benefit coming out of Russia in terms of weapon systems or in terms of technology? Or was it also in response to a certain changing geopolitics in the region? What sort of motivated Mr. Modi to have this informal summit with Mr. Putin?
Yes, I think the first question one might ask oneself, why do two countries who have so many formal legal channels, like bilateral meetings every year or 2 years, why would they suddenly need confidence building and an informal summit? Well, my answer to that would be that obviously there were issues which could not be placed in a formal summit. There were issues about third countries. There were and there were other issues which they needed to rebuild their confidence. And this is exactly the point you made earlier, that India's relationship with Russia appeared to be drifting. They appeared to be bending, and they might have been really bending towards the United States, fawning over possibilities of a closer strategic relations with the United States. The whole talk about the Quad and our strategic community especially, really pushing for a closer relationship, and a section of the Indian elite pressing for a closer relation with the United States. And from India's side, to be fair, they were worried about this very close strategic relation between Russia and China. The fact that their economies are, merging in many ways. And the fact that Russia, when it was first independent, had no relations in the 90s with Pakistan. But now they're building up their relations and even had a military exercise fairly close to some of our strategic interests and areas. And Russia's positions on Afghanistan and the fact that they have considered speaking to the Taliban, which India is still against. They argue that there is no such thing as good Taliban and bad Taliban, it's all Taliban, which is not the position of the US or even now Russia. So there were concerns on both sides, but they could not discuss, this could not be on a formal agenda. So I believe that is why an informal meeting was necessary and important. And the other reason for the informal meeting, which is very important, is the castor. The fact that President Trump, in his usual unilateral, erratic way, has imposed these huge sanctions on Russia after the alleged attacks, chemical weapons attack on Syria, which have not been proven. But nonetheless, they've put these sanctions. And these, in my view, would deeply hurt not only India-Russia defense relations, but India-Russia energy relations. And they would hurt world trade as a whole. because these supply chains are very complex. And these sanctions, the target is not just Russia. The target is a turn in world trade, to turn it towards the US, to make the US, in countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, more dependent on US arms, energy, oil exports, etc. Now that they have, started this fracking and new oil. So
that's an interesting reading. That's very interesting. You're basically saying that there is a certain desire from the United States in order to isolate Russia from countries like India and Vietnam, so that they can, at the end of the day, benefit geopolitically and materially in many words. That's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. I mean, why would US do anything which is not of benefit to it? These are not normative decisions of putting unilateral sanctions. With even Germany has resisted it, because even Angela Merkel has clearly said that they resist these sanctions because it would affect Germany's energy from Russia. Ultimately, even Ukraine, which is today Russia's so-called enemy, they still get energy from Russia. So the US actually would destabilize energy, defense, and overall trade through these sanctions. And I think someone in our ministry has been smart enough to realize that. And therefore, Prime Minister Modi has, in fact, I think, has gone there at a good time and assured Russia that it is time for them collectively to resist sanctions. Because for India, there are two things involved, several things actually. One is the fact that they have orders worth $12 billion at risk. Of this, 4.5 billion is on the S-400 air defense system. And this would impact not just Russia. You must remember that two regions of Russia and St. Petersburg, they would suffer immensely because they're very dependent on the military-industrial complex. I mean, we might be opposed to military-industrial complexes, but the reality is they exist and they will continue to exist. And it would hurt India because while India has tried to diversify its defense, and the dependence on Russia, which was earlier up to 80%, is now, as you said in the beginning, only it's come down to 62%. But 62% is a huge amount. Because also it's not just on, small things like some rifle. It's on complete defense platforms. Along with transfer of technology. There are deep internationally legal binding treaties which bind these two industries in Russia.
Well, Professor Chenoy, before we get into that, I want to ask you two questions. One is the whole informal summit part of it. How does an informal summit between the Prime Minister and the President somehow help them to wade through the complexities of the relationship and the geopolitical complexities that are arising at this point of time?
Well, look, one is an informal summit cannot take the place of a formal summit, but it has to feed into the formal summit.
Right.
But they needed this for reassurance. They needed it for confidence building in the sense that, for example, in an informal summit, Prime Minister Modi hypothetically could tell the Russians that, look, yes, we have relations with the US, but they're not going to impede our relations with Russia. There might be a lot of talk with the US, but the US has not actually delivered anything to India so far. Russia would tell, President Putin would tell Modi, for example, I mean hypothetically, that look, Pakistan is a problem for us also in terms of export of terror into Central Asia and Afghanistan. We have interests there. We cannot have deal with them through conflict. We have to deal with them through negotiation. So we are going just that much with them, and our interests with India will remain. Similarly, Putin could tell him about China, because Russia's relations with China are extremely complex. They're strategic, but they also don't have complete confidence between the two.
Right. Professor Chenoy, before we come to China, I have one more question about Russia, because you made this very interesting point about the fact that the Americans are not doing what they're doing with a certain normative intent in mind. Fair enough. What about Putin? Putin's actions have not all that been normative either. For example, he runs a totalitarian regime in many ways in Russia, and his own actions in Ukraine have not been without criticism. What's your sort of take on that? Obviously, we are not saying that statesmen have to be saintly at all points of time, but since we did make a point about the United States and the West, how do you sort of look at the whole Ukraine question and that of Putin's own regime in Russia?
Well, Putin is definitely amongst the world's populist leaders, meaning that he is again running a very tightly controlled command economy. Right. But we must remember that Putin has brought together a Russian state which was almost disintegrating. Russia is also federal, and many parts of the Russian Federation, provinces and republics within it, had laws contrary to those of the center. Through the Yeltsin period, the disintegration of the Soviet Union had not actually stopped in 1989. Russia was independent, but even there were Time magazine and Economist covers which showed that it is so multi-region, multi-ethnic, this disintegration will continue. In fact, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, parts of the Caucasus asked for independence, and they said, why not us? But Putin said, stop. And of course he used the military, but he also used political means to bring the Russian state back and to re-provide the Russian people with a lot of benefits that they had lost because of the sudden withdrawal of the state from social and economic and health and education sectors. Putin said, for example, that the biggest threat before Russia is our demographic decline. We don't see the US or anyone else as a threat. Our threats are our internal, the problems of our people. And that is what we want to address by making it a strong state. And therefore, he almost renationalized the energy, and he didn't allow defense to go into the private sector.
Right.
You might say that Putin has a lot of interests in energy. He has oligarchs which support him, and the oligarchs which do not support him have suffered as a consequence. He has recontrolled the media. But I think he also has a fine balance, and that is why there is a high level of popularity. Even independent polls say that 82% of the people do support him. So he has a kind of legitimacy also because of what he says and does. As far as Ukraine is concerned, we must remember that Ukraine has always been highly dependent on Russia, energy, etc. Crimea, which was very much part of Russia historically, was gifted to Ukraine only in 1954. And ethnically, there's a large number of Russian ethnic people staying there. Right. Now, they could have, made a federal Ukraine, and Crimea could have been happy there. But you had a right-wing regime, a semi-fascist regime in power in Ukraine, which imposed, which had issues about the use of Russian language. They saw Russian ethnic groups as secondary citizens. They targeted them, and the consequences that Crimea said, we want to go back to Russia. And Russia was only too happy to assist. So it was a classic example of what a country with a right-wing government can do to a people who already have some feeling that they do not belong. But if you try to enforce a Ukrainian nationalism over Crimea and ethnic Russians, they will then turn to Russia. And that is what they did. There was a referendum, and they decided to leave, and Russia supported them militarily. That's what history is.
Professor, in this time and age, the arguments about secessionism can be dangerous. I mean, you could always have cases like Kashmir or other cases where people could make that same argument. So you're basically saying that, yes, it happened in a certain peculiar historical context, but you're not saying that this was all perfectly fine, that it was not entirely normative. That's not the argument.
That's not the argument at all. In fact, I do not believe that in this kind of secessionism, because I believe more in rights. That you should ask if a people or a community or an ethnic group has an identity issue, another state will only, will not give them their rights. So they should actually move for rights and autonomy and federalism, etc. Right. But remember, India is very clear on and very sensitive about secessionism. But the official spokesperson and the official statement of India was that Russia was right on the Crimea issue. They supported Russia. They were amongst the few countries to support them. Why? Because they saw it as a very clear and specific case history in international politics and in the history of Russia and Soviet Union. And therefore they supported it.
Right. Professor Chenoy, let's talk a little bit about the India-Russia defense partnership and the emerging problems as it were. In fact, if you look at the India-Russia trade, the mainstay of the Indo-Russian trade seems to be in the defense sector. The bilateral trade was about $7.5 billion US in 2016, and much of this was in the defense sector. At the same time, the Indo-US defense trade increased from $1 billion in 2008 to over $15 billion in 2016. Russia continues to be India's largest defense supplier. It has been steadily losing its share in India's arms imports, dropping from, say, 79%, as you put it, in 2008 to 62% now. So in this backdrop, will the Indian closeness to the United States negatively impact the relationship with the Russian Federation, especially in the defense sector?
Well, it depends how you look at it. Well, the way I look at it is, and I think how Russia, China and India officially at least look at it, is their argument is that this is a multipolar world, which means you do not have to be linked to one pole militarily. You can have linkages with separate. You can have a relationship with one country without alienating another. Right. And you can see China. China has very high trade with the US, but they're a strategic partner of Russia. They can balance both, and I think India needs to do that. But there's also a political issue. In this, there has been argument from our defense experts that we need to diversify our defense, which is correct, but we also need to look at costs. And for example, I believe that the Rafale deal, a lot of people have critiqued it for its cost, because the mix, for example, is a better deal. So it's not always just about diversification, it's also about politics. And I think there should be a very clean balance between them. There should be military experts along with our civilian bureaucrats who make these judgments, and there should be a fair bit of transparency in them. This is the world of transparency.
But there is also an associated problem. China is the biggest buyer of Russian weapons today. So if Russians sell weapons to India and China at the same time, and if there is a future conflict between India and China, how is that going to play out? So I think there is also a thinking within Delhi that we need to diversify our sources of weaponry, also because China is buying the same weapons. Or the same defenses against those weapons?
Well, you see, the Russian argument is that they're not actually giving the same weapons to China. There is a difference, and the weapons to India are more superior. Second, China has, earlier they had the CKD, knockdown technology. Now they have copied it, and they are going to gradually become one of the biggest weapons manufacturers, and their reliance on Russia or any other country has actually decreased dramatically. But nonetheless, they still get a lot of, especially submarines, nuclear submarines, etc., from Russia. And the issue is that Russia now is, and this is one issue in the informal talks, which we definitely, and because in the context of India, Russia and China, that I think it's open knowledge that Russia used its good offices during the Doklam crisis to ask China to de-escalate, step down. And it's in it's in their interest that relations between India and China improve. And I think they're putting pressure, especially on China, to look at the Indian positions in a more sympathetic way and not see India as a threat. China should see the West and the US as a primary threat as opposed to India. So this whole, the China's greatest fears now have shifted to the South China Seas. So in that, India is not a threat. Their second biggest issue is the BRI, in which India sees it, that section of the BRI is problematic, which goes through some strategically sensitive areas near Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
And also sovereignty concerns.
And also issues of sovereignty. But Russia has leverage on China, just as China has leverage on Russia.
Yeah, talking about sanctions, I mean, if the American sanctions come into being, come into force against the Russian defense industry, will that not affect India? Because remember, at the end of the day, the Russia-India trade is only 7.5 billion. With the United States, it's almost 100 billion plus. So you are unlikely to sacrifice a relationship that is $100 billion worth in order to salvage a relationship that is only 7.5 billion worth. What is your sort of take on that?
Well, look, the Times of India said that $12 billion are at stake for India. Right. Now, $12 billion is not a small amount, and all these are all big orders. Further, Russia's support on Kashmir in every meeting is an issue. Russia's support on India in the Security Council, they cannot undo 60 years of relationship. Mm-hmm. That is what the informal meeting was also about. How to circumvent this.
Is there also, a wire media?
Yes, is there a wire media? The other thing is, we have to remember, when the US put sanctions on India, the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, after 1998 Pokhran blasts, the only country which offered to continue with supplying those nuclear energy plants to Kudankulam was Russia. In fact, Kudankulam too was put at hold by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, not by the Russians. They said, we don't care about sanctions. We don't believe in unilateral sanctions. Russia has systematically critiqued unilateral sanctions against Iraq, Iran. So Russia and India do not believe in those kind of sanctions. In the Human Rights Council, India has repeatedly taken a position that if there are sanctions, they should go through the United Nations and Security Council. Because they do not, India has violated sanctions by the US in many places, including in Myanmar, including in North Korea, and including between Russia and India. So why should they can find ways to bypass it? I think Indian legal minds are smart enough to do it. And I think it's time to put some pressure on President Trump. After all, he has not stepped on Indian soil despite all this fawning over the great Trump by a large part of the strategic community.
How do you view the Russia-Pakistan relationship, the warmth that we are witnessing in the recent past?
This is also complex in the sense because I believe now Pakistan is almost like a client state of China. And China must have had a factor in putting some pressure on Russia to have some negotiations with Pakistan, but also Russia's own concerns about terrorism. It's a huge concern, much bigger concern than that of the West or the Chinese. It's as big a concern as India has of terrorism. It's a real one because Chechen terrorists, within many of the republics of Russia, Afghanistan, which is on the border, Central Asia. So any kind of fundamentalism and terrorism is a real issue. Also, the drug inflow, along with terrorism, the informal trading and the thing about the drug passages through Pakistan and Afghanistan into Central Asia and Russia, it's a huge problem. Right. Trafficking in women. Right. So all these issues, they need to talk and put pressure on Pakistan. And it is a problem for China also. So I think all the states together alone can put pressure to make Pakistan change it from a rogue state actually.
But how should we look at the question of Taliban? You did mention earlier that Russia and India look at the whole phenomenon of Taliban very differently. The Russians have a special envoy in Afghanistan talking to the Taliban, whereas India has been consistent in its argument that there is no question of talking to the Taliban because there is no difference between good Taliban and the bad Taliban. Does the Russian argument of talking to the moderate elements within the Taliban movement, is that a good idea? Should India sort of awaken to the reality that everyone else is talking to the Taliban, so India should also talk to the Taliban? Is that a good idea at all?
Well, look, I think for that we need to look at the Taliban. From what I have read, I think Taliban is a part of the structure of Afghan society. They're not, of course, initially they came from outside and they do have external links with Pakistan. But the intertribal issues, etc., violence, fundamentalism, radicalism are all aspects of Afghan society now. If the Afghans are talking to the Taliban and we have close relations with the Afghan regime and we have huge investments there, they can go waste if we do not talk to the Taliban. I'm not saying immediately start bending to the Taliban, but I think we need to have a strategy where we need to analyze the Taliban, and ultimately in all these kind of even radicalized organizations, there might be some sliver of hope where there are some rational thinkers who believe in a political solution as opposed to just the use of force.
How do you look at the Chinese BRI project? You mentioned that in one of your answers. The Russians have been upbeat about it. In fact, the Foreign Minister Lavrov recently said that India should consider joining the BRI. Should we see this as an alternative mega project, as it were, alternative connectivity project in the broader region, and probably shed our inhibitions and see ways of circumventing some of the sovereignty concerns on others and talk to the Chinese? Is that a good way of going about? Because everyone else seems to be on board except India in this particular case.
No, I think even some of the Western countries are very fearful about it. Because this is a huge project. It is going to make China, it has a potential to make China as a part of a G2, the US and China.
Right.
That is the potential of the project. It's huge connectivity. It will be a transportation revolution. It will connect China's rural areas to the rest of the world, especially Southeast Asia and to Russia and to West Asia. The delivery of Chinese goods directly, it will be a new technological and communication revolution, and people do not know about it and they are fearing. But it has different links. It has a road connection going into Southeast Asia. It has connection which will almost circumvent India, right from Pakistan to Bangladesh to Myanmar. That is what we are concerned about. And they have a separate project through Russia to Europe. It connects different ways, waterways, airways, roadways, different kind of links. Russia has been arguing for a north-south corridor for years with India. India has not moved sufficiently on these. There's been a lot of talk, but not enough walk on these issues.
But with the American sanctions on Iran kicking in, it's going to be even more.
They've been talking about it for 20 years.
That's correct.
The last 20 years, on every bilateral meeting of India and Russia, there's been this talk of the north-south corridor. There's been talk of the Pakistan-India link, but we've moved too slowly. And I don't know why there have been so many fears about it. So China now has come in, and so India shouldn't do everything on the defensive. India should have taken up these initiatives. Of course, India also has its roadways coming up. They have a roadway from the northeast to Bangladesh, which is very important. A roadway linking Myanmar to other areas in India's Look East policy. But what I'm arguing is that India will ultimately have to engage. They should not see all this just as a threat.
Right.
They have to engage, they have to research, they have to understand. They cannot just come to quick political conclusion for their own nationalism.
And they have to negotiate.
They have to negotiate.
And there will be a problem.
Yeah.
Those will be negotiated. They have to be negotiated.
And they have to look, there's so much academic research available on these projects. Are our ministries looking at it?
Good question.
They're not. The material is there. The alternatives are there. But these blinkered visions that we know it all have led to a lot of, if I may say so, I don't know if you want to call it errors, but we could have done better.
Professor Chenoy, one more question about the emerging multipolarity. Both China and Russia seem to have emerged as counterpoles to the United States today. Is that good news for the international system? Will it necessarily, the emergence of China and Russia as counterpoles to the United States, will that mean necessarily more peace and order and stability in the international system? And how should India view this, the multipolar world as it is emerging today?
By the way, India also thinks it's a pole. So it's not just Russia and China.
Okay.
India argues that they also are a pole. All the BRICS say that, and that is a reason for their coming together. Because they all believe that they are major powers, emerging powers, which means what? That they don't need one pole, and there's no going back on this. There will be poles. But there are also critical thinkers who say that these poles, yes, it has given developing countries more options. You can now choose between the US or Russia or China or even India. But nonetheless, their policies are not greatly different. So there is a Chinese imperialism emerging. And a lot of people in Africa, for example, say, yes, it's good that, it's an alternative to AFRICOM and the US army following US trade.
Yeah.
But the Chinese also have their first military base in Djibouti.
What about the Russians?
The Russians have a base in Syria, Khartoum.
So what is better, one big hegemon or many small minor hegemons for the international system?
Yeah, if it's inevitable that you have to have hegemons, I think minor hegemons are better because they would sort of balance. But, my argument always is that without looking at what people are saying, none of these hegemons are really going to be working too well.
Professor Chenoy, one last question. Where do you see the Russia-India relationship going from here after the summit in Sochi?
I think this Sochi summit has been very important, and it's also a sliver, one of the threads left in an possible independent foreign policy, which was being threatened. India's independent foreign policy. India's always had an independent foreign policy, but if you get too aligned with the United States, they never have any very close relationship with anyone who wants independent foreign policy. Mm-hmm. They only want a client-state relationship. With China, it's been different. With China, their relationship is one where they've had an independent foreign policy, and they've become another pole. I think India can follow, not completely. I'm not a great admirer of the Chinese model of extraction of surplus and making such a strong state at the cost of people. But nonetheless, I believe that India's relationships with Russia give it still that flavor of an independent foreign policy. India's relationship with the third world countries, with Syria, with some of the West Asian countries make it an independent foreign policy. But a lot of it is also compromised if you keep quiet and you kind of go along with the US even when it's not in your interest. You have to see your interest, historically, you cannot forget history. You cannot have myth as a replacement of history. Yes, it's good to reform, but it has to be a process.
So for India, multi-alignment, you would say, is the answer as far as
yes, multi-alignment, which will reflect India's plurality. You have to have plural relationships.
Right. Professor Chenoy, great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.